Welcome once again to Arctic Fire. This unique gathering of swordsmiths explores the outer edge of the craft, where craftsmanship, artistry, storytelling, history, and myth combine. This year, the group has recreated objects found in the legendary hoard of Grendel, from the most ancient surviving poem in Old English, Beowulf. 4 days of live broadcast, in which legends will be reborn. Arctic Fire 2016, Grendel's Hoard.
I have made for Grendel's Hoard a recreation of the Lyre of Lejre. That's not supposed to be there yet. I was doing so great. This is what I was looking for. This is the information that we have. This is a drawing that comes to us from a priest, Ulrich Fries, and it depicts portions of a lyre. And also, most interestingly to me, a bridge that appears to be, Peter, I haven't asked you about this yet, actually. The writing in the bottom, does it indicate anything about the material that this was made in?
He wasn't, Ulrich, I think he had a rather high opinion on his own sort of hobby level expertise on things. I don't know exactly, but I think these drawings were made in a little bit of a sales pitch to collectors that he hoped to get a good response from. So if he talks about solid gold, it might be gilded or it might be just very bright brass. So I don't know, since we don't have the actual pieces remaining, I don't know if we will ever be sure what they, but it's surely some kind of metal, some kind of yellow metal.
Yes.
And gilding, at least, is not unreasonable, looking at
not at all.
what is common at the time.
Right.
If you remember the spear I have, the wolves are green, so I suppose that the yellow color
that's
here
true.
indicates gilding at least.
That's true. It wouldn't have been. Yeah, that's true.
Well, that's certainly where my romantic heart took me when I saw this drawing, which has a couple other interesting facts, or at least implications. The first being the wonderful drinking cup mark of some kind. When I saw this drawing, I thought, now there's a man after my own heart, who at some point, unfortunately, left this imprint. I would love to know who and when. That's so fabulous. Also, curiously enough, on this drawing, is this damage here, which has led me to believe that it may in fact be damage from Grendel himself. So this is something we will come to. So we have Grendel and his grievance. From Seamus Heaney, we have then a powerful demon, a prowler through the dark, nursed a hard grievance. It harrowed him to hear the din of the loud banquet every day in the hall, the harp being struck, and the clear song of a skilled poet, telling with mastery of man's beginnings. This was the phrase of the poem when I saw that drawing that really inspired me to want to make a lyre. I've made one before. I've been fascinated with the lyre as an object for a long time. But when I saw that drawing, I said, this is the thing that I want to recreate, because it's a really telling object, especially if, as I suspect, it indicates that it was damaged by Grendel himself in the drawing. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the lyre and its place in this hall culture, and why in particular Grendel may have had some kind of love and hate relationship with it. I am going to imagine that this is a gilded object. We don't have the actual objects, which is something of a tragedy. They were lost in the firestorm of Dresden, and it is fortuitous to us that the drawing was parted with when the actual objects were not, because it is only because the drawing was sold that we still have it. There's so many stories like that. The Galeus horns also, there's a lyre I'll talk about that also suffers a similar fate. But these are the stories that these objects have to tell us. So, just talk a little bit about it. I think it's been touched on before, so I'll be brief. We have Lyre here. It has recently been pretty much confirmed that the actual hall of Lejre was located here. This is very exciting. This would be sort of a typical hall structure. This would be quite a bit smaller, I think, than Lejre, which is remarked upon as being one of the grandest halls ever established, but the architecture is similar and the setting would be something of like that. This would be the place where the war band would gather, where they would feast, which was sort of before the consolidation of things in the Christian era. Feasting was more or less like the court of the Viking Age and earlier. This was they were ritual times, eating and drinking, and boasts were made and commands were issued. It's in a space like this, and often in connection with an object like this. Typical landscape hall, the Lejre, is located very high. We know from the poem that they see the approach of the ships from the sea, despite the fact that it's quite far inland. It's on a high space. You would be able to see quite a lot from there. I'd like to imagine it's on top of a hill there, right up here, where the trees have now grown over. That's what I think. And I also want to give you some imagery. Can you imagine that you are Beowulf? Actually, you know what? Imagine that you are not Beowulf. And this is what you're confronted with. And someone says, there are monsters down there, and they come up at night, and they ravage the hall because they hear the sounds of laughter, and they hear our joy, and they are so envious. Are you going to swim down in there and try and kill them? Yeah, because I'm not. I'm not doing that. Okay. So, we'll talk about lyres as objects and the remains that we have and the things that I believe led me to make somewhat appropriate decisions about the object I have. This is probably one of the most well-known finds, though at this point in history not one of the most complete. This is the Sutton Hoo finds. This is the condition of the actual lyre as found, and we can see some really interesting details about the construction here, probably a mortise and tenon connection there of some kind. We do have these fabulous escutcheons, which is one of my favorite words now, and we have this incredible curved damage of the lyre from being buried in a mound and suffering probably some kind of acidic soil conditions and compression, all kinds of damage, laid out more or less as it was found. And from that, we are able to extrapolate that this is more or less what the condition of some of these lyres were like in their original nature. So the escutcheons are here, the tuning pegs. Up high 6 is fairly traditional. Some have a few more, 7. I don't think there's any finds with more strings, but there's certainly implications of lyres with more strings in some later art, which may actually be influenced by the fact that these are 12th and 13th century depictions of earlier objects, and these later ones have many more strings. But 6 seems very traditional and common. The Sutton Hoo, like a couple of the others, has these very interesting, they're almost like rivets that go through along the edges to hold the construction in. I'll show you a little bit more about the construction in a bit. Tail pieces, I don't actually know is that there are tailpieces in existence. I think they're slightly conjectured. Petter, do you know about that?
I'm not sure. It would be useful to look at the Trossingen example, because that's really...
And it has the snob where you could, it could be different. Well, I put a tailpiece on mine because it makes it work. So then there's typically a bridge in here, and this is a really classic Anglo-Saxon style. They're more straight than what I've done. This is the finds of the, it's often called the Cologne lyre, or the St. Severin's Church lyre, where it was discovered in a stone slab grave with a, it's referred to as a minstrel also, but all we know is that there was a skeleton in there, and he actually had a robe with some very nice gold embroidery, so clearly not a pauper. And that's 7th to 8th century. The Sutton Hoo is probably early 7th century, which is a little later than the Beowulf period. But we know, and I can show you a good example, that this instrument is continuous for a very long time before that. This is a reconstruction of the Cologne lyre. And in particular, the shape of the Cologne lyre and these images on several wood carvings and some rock carvings in Gotland were inspirational in my interpretation of the remainder of the lyre as compared to the drawing. The drawing does seem to indicate a similar shape coming through here. I mean, we really only have this kind of funny section over here. But I would have anticipated, of course, that the rest would be symmetrical, although there is a lyre from Iona that is asymmetrical, which is kind of interesting. This is it's called the Trossingen lyre. Now, when I first became interested in lyres of this period, there were no complete examples. And there was a lot of conjecture. And this piece showed up, it's either in the late 90s or early 2000s. It was actually discovered as they were excavating for a car park for a harmonica factory in Germany, a fact which I think is pretty amazing. And it's almost entirely complete, which is remarkable for an object of such thin wood construction. And not only is the form and shape and the bridge of it remarkably complete, but it also has this wonderful technique called kohlrosing, which is engraving into the wood with a tool and rubbing soot or some other dark carbony thing into and covering that over with like an oily wax. The more interesting thing about that for me is the depiction of the warriors on the lyre, because this clearly places it in the realm of this sort of class of the warrior rulers. And this instrument, it was not the instrument of the common person, I should think, because the burials associated with it tend to be very rich. And now we have, in fact, confirmation that the skalds of old singing praise of the warrior kings are depicted right on the object itself. So it really places the lyre in this courtly, pre-Christian courtly realm of warrior kings. We come to some other details about how these things were made, and this is an amazing object. This is a bridge found on the Isle of Skye in Scotland in a cave. It is dated to 500 BC. So we know that these lyres, in this form, we associate them with the Germanic world. They know that they go back to the ancient world. I mean, you can think of the original, Greek lyre with the tortoise shell and the horns and the whole myth associated with that. It's an ancient instrument, but this particular find, it looks just like the other bridges that we tend to see. And that, for me, is it's a pretty amazing thing, placing this object deeply rooted in the ancient world of Northern Europe. These, an example of some other bridges. They were made in lots of different materials. The previous one I showed you, I'm not sure what the wood is on this sky bridge. This is an image of an amber lyre. There's a number of amber lyres, a beautiful material. And this is the Trossingen lyre bridge, which I believe is oak. And this sort of sweeping shape coming up to these crenellated points is fairly typical. Some of them, so much so that I think they may even be implying a fortress or a keep as an image, which is a very interesting thing, like the last one. I think if you can sort of imagine that, this is some sort of keep, and these are little sort of like fortified crenellations or sharpened sticks even. There may be a sort of martial implication in the shape there. This is the one that is closest to the image we have of the Lyre of Lejre. This is from the British Museum. It's in bronze. This is a pin that's also associated with that find, presumably a tuning pin for the lyre, and it has these wonderful beasts that come up and meet their mouths. It has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 strings, just like every other lyre, and it's really nice to see the similarity between this form and the form of the drawing that we have fortuitously come upon. So, I'm going to talk about some other ornamentation that is very typically associated with this. Remember, I pointed out the escutcheons on the Sutton Hoo lyre. These are from the Taplow hoard, which is a really wonderful collection of objects found in a burial that was about 6th century. It's also really interesting because the artwork in it sort of transits a couple of the styles that we would start to find in the Beowulfian era, Solon I and Solon II. You can see in this piece we have the same sort of chip carving that looks like it's in the drawing of the objects that we have. And it seems like some of these things they're fairly traditional forms. The details in the subject matter may vary. Clearly, here we have bird of prey, eagle, raven, hard to say. Also, very clearly in the drawing that we have a wolf. And I like to hope and think that maybe it's a Beowulf. Okay, so we come back to that drawing. Unfortunately, the escutcheon up here has been cut off by my presentation program, and I can't fix that for you. So we'll just have to look at what I have later. So this is me making my recreation. Now, these objects were typically hollowed out of a solid body for the back, and then the soundboard was attached with those rivets. It looks like very often hide glues were used. It's also fairly typical on a lot of them that the soundboard portion is cut off here, and the rest is mortised so that the solid body comes up all the way around. In this case, it looks like from the drawing that it's one continuous piece of wood going all the way up around. And because I love beautiful pieces of wood, I wanted to see that happen all the way around the edge of my reconstruction. So the other thing that's kind of interesting to point out is we don't have any examples that indicate in modern luthiery. It's very common to book match a soundboard, and that actually happens to be for structural reasons as well as aesthetic. The wood will tend to warp more symmetrically if it is split from one piece and then opened and put together. It looks really good. Certainly some of the other objects appear to have been one solid soundboard across the entire piece, but I think Schildingar are very advanced and also really, really enjoy beauty in material culture. So They probably book match theirs because it looks so good. That's what I think. This is a close-up of my bridge that I have constructed. It has, again, these two wolf-like faces that come to meet each other. And another interesting thing to talk about, also completely conjectural on my part, but again, I think that the advancements and value that the Schildingar placed on awesome would probably have allowed them to come to this particular advancement in technology, which is the sound hole. The Trossingen lyre is the only lyre that appears to have these sound holes. And they work. That's one of the reasons I put them on there, was because the one I built previously, two actually, was solid body, and the sound comes out, the sound projects, but it projects a little bit more if there's these holes there. And I think it's not a further leap until we get sound holes appear in instruments. So I think it's a really interesting transitory moment in technology of musical instruments. So yeah, I think it goes there. That's what I think. So this is my interpretation of the drawing of the escutcheon. And we have on this, this is bronze. I'm going to be demonstrating later gilding, because the drawing that we have really does seem to indicate gold in the color. It doesn't seem to have much evidence of a deterioration or a discoloration that would be associated with bronze. So we have a wolf-like face again, and this lyre, I'd like to think, maybe came with one of Beowulf's skalds. It could have been in the court of Herod, but with such strong wolf imagery throughout the whole object, I like to think that it's somebody who came along on the ship with Beowulf and was possibly killed in the attack of Grendel, because there is that mysterious damage to the lyre itself in the drawing. We have this serpent-like shape coming around here. Another indication for me that it could be a reference to Beowulf, because there's a sort of an epic section in the poem about Beowulf and a swimming contest, and being attacked by serpents for a very long time and surviving them. So the serpent could be associated with Beowulf. And there is this curious shape here, which I'm not really sure what that's about right now. So now we come to the playing of the instrument. How does this instrument work? This instrument that is said to be accompanying skalds and poets, especially in the pre-Christian age, often referred to as a harp. In this sort of transitory period that we have between the heathen material, so the heathen warrior culture, and this transition into a more Christian culture that becomes less and less warband-like in its nature. We have depictions of the instrument being played, and that tells us something about it. In particular, there are quite a few images like this. This would be King David playing the harp, writing the Psalms. What is this from? Where is it from? It's I can't actually remember. It's a very famous manuscript, but there's a bunch like it, and they sort of show this same playing thing. I have my theories about this method of playing, because it's not actually easy to play the instrument that way. And so much so that people have kind of come to this conclusion that they need to construct this kind of strap to hold their hand in this place. And what I think is that this is a Christian image, and it is concerned with the beauty, the solace of being in heaven, the intellectual qualities, not with the earthly, rocking sort of world at all. I think this is illustrating something about how you play it, but it's not actually showing you how to hold it and play it, I think, for the most part. If I try and do that, it wants to fall. It's really awkward. I think that this is about the nice harp playing style, too, because when you're going to play this, there's different things you can do with it. And it seems like such a very simple instrument. You would be like, oh, what can you do with this? Kind of lame. Yeah, look at that. It's got 6 strings, dude. You can't even fret it or anything. So I think when you have something this simple, you do everything you can with it to get a sound out of it. And indeed, what I'll talk about in a minute, there are some African instruments that are very similar that they get played another way that I'm going to show you. But I can sort of show you what I think happens here if you're going to play a nice tune, and you're going to sound very like, oh, I'm playing my harp in heaven. You could be like. So that would be, interestingly, it's an Irish tune. I play a lot of Irish music too. And that's a tune that gets played in contemporary traditional Irish music called Brian Boru's March. And if you don't know, Brian Boru was a high king of Ireland who kicked the Vikings out sometime in the 8th or 9th century. But you can play the whole tune on this instrument with 6 strings, which would have been a little bit late for this instrument, but perhaps also romantically associated with ancient things. I think this could be a very ancient tune, but probably not one you would play in heaven. I don't think you should play this instrument in heaven. Most people play any instrument in heaven. I think it's more likely the instrument gets played like this. This is what I think. And we're not ready for that yet. No, hold on. It's pretty interesting because there's some theories. Some people think, well, you only played kind of the way I was doing this, and maybe you could do repetitive. You could do some like kind of repetitive riffs while you're telling a story and singing a song. But you can also do this. It's called block and strum, and that is simply damping the strings you don't want to hear. Which may be what's indicated actually by this hand position, which I think, again, is illustrating maybe a nice way to play it, but showing you what you can do. The block and strum allows you to do chords. And there's it must be like 11th century manuscript that actually talks about the tuning of the lyre, even though it's a very antiquated instrument at the time, and says it's the first 6 notes of a major scale, which allows you, with just 3 fingers, I can do a major scale. If I just move my hand down, I can do the relative minor. And if I just move 1 finger, I can do another related major. And just 1 finger down from there, and I hit another related minor. So all of a sudden it opens up these sort of rocking possibilities where you can start to do some more really interesting things with it. And lastly, there's also some droning possibilities, which become great. This I found, like I said, I've been really interested in lyres for a very long time, when I was like 20 or 21 or something. I went on a backpacking tour of the British Isles. I went to the British Museum because I really wanted to see the Sutton Hoo lyre. There it was. And in the store, there was a cassette tape of somebody playing it, which was awesome for me. And So I kind of tried to learn what they were doing from the recording, and some of those songs were actually, or I should say tunes, were documented. But there was another way of playing, droning a melody and strumming. And that's very fun too, and very easy. And you can see how a poem or song may have accompanied this. And so one of the reasons I chose that particular Seamus Heaney quote is because he speaks of the skald or the poet telling of man's beginnings. And I also think this may be a glossing over of some pagan traditions with Christian traditions, because one of the most important poems in the Germanic mythos would be the Voluspa, the seeress who tells of the way that the world is made. It's how we know of things like the giant's flood, and it would be something that would have been told, I think, with great respect in a heathen court. And I think that it's not unlikely to think that in adopting Christianity, they would simply have transferred a lot of this same stuff. So I'll see if I can actually pull this one off. This is how I think in English, so you can understand the words. Maybe perhaps the tales of man's beginnings were told. Hear me, all ye hallowed beings, both high and low of Heimdall's kin, that wilt, my father, that I well set forth the fates of the world which is first I recall. I call to mind the kin of Ettins, which long ago did give me life. 9 worlds I know, the 9 abodes, the glorious world tree, the ground beneath. Earliest times did ye mere live, was nor sea, nor land, nor salty wave, neither earth was there, nor upper heaven, but gaping nothing, and green things nowhere. Was the land then lifted aloft by persons who made Midgard, the matchless earth, shone from the south, the sun on dry land, the ground then grew, the green so soft. But it's a really long poem, and I don't know the whole thing, so that's all you're getting out of me. Yeah. Goes on forever. So the only other thing I would like to mention about playing this instrument, and I haven't attempted this technique yet. This is really amazing. I think that a lot of us would have trouble with this, but I'm fairly convinced that if this indicates we should always play this instrument like this, I think that perhaps this image indicates that we should also try playing it with our feet, like Gunnar in the snake pit, because I think there's actually more images of this than of the other style. I would like to think of this as an instrument that can be liberated for reenactors, and we should rock out. In fact, I want to make one with a pickup and a whammy bar. Yeah. So that's it for me. That's the Lyre of Lejre, and I am been happy to present to you the Lyre of Lejre today. Any questions?
From Glenn Cleaton, what is the material for the strings and the wood? I think you did talk about the wood, but it's okay.
Yeah.
And have you found you can hit harmonic points on the strings?
Oh, okay. Yeah, the string question is a great one. These strings are weed whacker wire, which has a really great tensile strength. Other modern applications are like deep sea fishing line is another thing that tends to sound really good on these. Now, as far as what we know about historically, it seems like gut would have been a very likely thing, and there are mentions of gold and silver strings, and when you read those things, you have to be a little bit careful. Is this hyperbole? Is this exaggeration or kenning? but the technology does seem to exist to make wire metal strings, and they show up for certain just after this era, I would say, in the 1200s and so forth. Now you start getting wire-strung harps. But we had an earlier discussion about these wound bronze strings that would have been drawn through a plate that seemed like they would be great candidates. It was Peter, you
During a visit to Bonn recently, I talked to restorer there. One of them had made practical experimentations with to try to copy or reconstruct the construction method of Roman bronze or brass wire that was used for armor actually, but also for other applications. And it's a specific alloy of bronze that is a combination of zinc and tin with rather interesting tensile and stainless capabilities. And it involved folding or rolling a thin sheet that is 0.2 millimeter, 0.2 millimeter thick into a tiny little roll, and then drawing that roll through a wire, what do you call it?
Draw plate.
Draw plate, down in size. First compacting it and then drawing it out. And the resulting wire had some very, very interesting mechanical capabilities. And when we think about the problems of casting an ingot and doing a solid wire from the ingot, with problems of different grain size and stuff like that, you might understand why they go through the problem of first making a thin sheet, rolling it up, and then drawing a wire from that. So if they did it in the Roman age, of course there is no guarantee they continued doing that in the period of Beowulf, but at least it's a technique that existed previous to the lyre.
Yeah, I know that encourages me, because I had sort of like written off metal strings as a practical, or as a theoretical reality, and hearing that is encouraging. So I really want to follow up on it. Yeah.
There's another interesting upfollow of that. There was a dagger found with a copper blade that is some kind of, I think it's dated to sort of contemporary to Stonehenge, as a really, really early Copper Age dagger, where the wooden hilt is covered all over with tiny, 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 tiny little tacks of gold. And every one of these gold tacks had a spiral structure to them. And the reconstruction team were mystified by it, how they could make such tiny spirals. But if you draw them down from thicker material, the spiral will continue down. So that there may be, and in that case, this kind of construction dates back to Stonehenge period, which is quite astounding, if it's true.
Right. Well,
conjecture.
The other bridge goes back to 500 BC. So, I had one of my earlier lyres that I constructed just out of curiosity. I strung with steel strings, and it really started warping it pretty badly. So the tension that gets built up on the object is another thing to consider. Was one of the reasons I made this a little bit more robust, so I could actually explore strings. That's one of my next questions to explore and play with on this object. So, good question. You were also asking about the materials. It does seem like maple. It's European maple. I mean, I made mine out of American maple, but European maple does seem like a fairly common soundboard material. Also, we find oak. The back is often, I think sometimes you find, I'm trying to remember, but I think some of them are oak on the back and maple on the top. But maple does seem to be the more consistent soundboard material in general. That's definitely not true across the board. And since you're asking questions like that, the Trossing in lyre was basically almost exactly 1/4 of an inch thick around the bridge, and the remainder was thinner, coming closer to 1/8 of an inch, probably on the inside and not on the top. But I do think either with this one or a future construction, I'm going to play with some of those dimensions and see what happens. The other lyre that I made, even after I switched out of the steel strings with all the pressure, even the nylon strings pushed the center down. So I think there's some suggestions that there could have been bracing in some of these, but it could also just be a matter of gentle carving to create a little more structural stability there. I don't know. It's one of those things where you add modern Luthery experience to interpreting these ancient things and assume people weren't stupid 1,000 years ago. Yeah. Yes.
Is there any traces of the possibility of actually making the front a little bit like a violin, that it raised a little bit?
They do. All the finds that I've seen don't seem, any of the documentation I've ever read doesn't seem to indicate any kind of vaulting, though, like I said, the Trossingen lyre is supposedly thicker near the bridge and thinner near the edges. I don't know personally if that's thinned out of the inside or the top. Mm-hmm. It would be very easy after making it to tune the sound by going back in and thinning those edges. But they don't. None of them visually seem to be indicating anything like the stability you get from constructing a violin by rounding it.
And the shape of the bridge would be a clue to that as well. If it's
right, the bridges are all flat.
Okay,
yes,
so
that's your perfect clue. Yes,
yeah,
exactly.
So we've got a question from John Storm. He says, how is the tuning mechanism constructed? And he was asking about the strings too, but you already asked.
Oh, okay. The tuning is, they all just have pegs that are in the wood, and you just have to match the taper of the peg to the taper of the hole that you bore. I did that with modern violin tools, but it's wouldn't be that hard to do otherwise. There's a couple that do seem to indicate having metal pegs that are in by different friction. Right.
There was like a tuning.
Right. There's a tuning. There's some with square tops and tuning keys. The Sutton Hoo, as I call, actually has more decorative square tops on the top.
And your pegs those are boxwood.
Right. These are boxwood, which is a very plausible material to carve a peg out of. It's really super stable. It's English boxwood, so it's a very available material. And it actually does get used even in modern instruments for things like tuning pegs and tailpieces because it's really dense. It's really smooth. It was such a pleasure to actually work with it. Jim Kelso, if you happen to be watching, gave me a very fine piece when he moved his studio of this English boxwood, which has been turned into the Lyre of Lejre. Yeah. Mm-hmm. It's kind of nice to have a piece of Jim Kelso on there too.
For you, the questions keep coming. You might want to log on and answer them yourself. But
we'll change
you
my
might
screen,
be
so I
interested.
shouldn't.
There's many very complimentary comments, but one I thought you might be interested in is Tree Valentino says, in all caps, Slayer with an exclamation point.
It's going to have to wait until I do the solid body electric lyre with the whammy bar. Sorry, hon. Yeah, but we'll do that. We'll get the effects pedal. Yeah, I'll sing in the dog voice, I'll be the next black metal thing, they'll say. That'll be cool.
All right, well done, you all.
Yay.